Hello, student. This is your exam review for Unit 1 in Texas government. Okay, we talked about the Railroad Commission, which was originally set up to regulate the railroads in Texas, but it doesn't do that anymore. In fact, what it does now is regulate the oil and gas industry. It does not regulate it does not regulate railroads any longer. Okay, there was a treaty between the United States and Mexico and Canada called NAFTA, stood for North American Free Trade Agreement. Okay, it was recently replaced by a new agreement, which is not all that new, just had some amendments and some updating, and it's called the U.S., Mexico, and Canada Trade Agreement. Okay, the economy in Texas grew rapidly in the 1990s and closely was closely tied to expanding manufacturing in Texas. Texas had previously not been known for manufacturing. Okay. In 1950, the Supreme Court case Sweat versus Painter established equality for persons of all races for professional schools. That's how Texas Southern University got its law school, because of this lawsuit. From the beginning of the state of Texas, the Democratic Party has been predominant, and until recently. The area from El Paso down to McAllen and Brownsville, being a largely Hispanic area, has been pro-Democratic, has voted Democratic in most elections. But there was a new party called the La Raza Unida party that popped up in order to try to elect some Hispanics to posts down there, which were at that time all being won by gringos, by Anglos. Texas is often characterized as the low tax and low social service state, because obviously without a good tax base, you can't provide a lot of social services for the people. But people like low taxes, but they also like government services, and so there has to be some trade out in that regard. Okay, privatization of public policy was considered to be a vital task after Texas entered into the Union in 1845, because Texas retained its right to the private lands that it owned, and those lands at that time were considered useless. They were just desert, nothing would grow there. But then they found something underneath that land, something that's sometimes called black gold or Texas tea, oil. The University of Texas and Texas A&M particularly benefit from the money that comes from the oil and gas leases that Texas has from its public lands. The state of Texas gets royalties, and most of those royalties go to support the University of Texas and Texas A&M. In 1861, Texas had to create a new constitution. Texas has been under 6 constitutions, and the one in 1861 was because it joined the Confederacy, so they had to form a new constitution because they were joining the Confederacy. Okay, the current constitution that Texas now operates under was passed and adopted in 1876. And when they were drafting that Constitution, the main focus was the necessity of strong limitations on the power of state government, because they had just gone through a very repressive state government during the Reconstruction period, and so they were reeling from that matter. So they limited the the power of the government, and they felt that the best way to do that is to make all the offices elective, very few appointed offices. Texas Bill of Rights is found in Article 1 of the Texas Constitution, and it has more rights in it than the U.S. Bill of Rights in the U.S. Constitution. According to Article 5 of the Texas Constitution, judges are elected. The only time they get appointed is when there's a vacancy or a new court that has been formed, and so there's no judge, and they have to appoint, the governor appoints an interim judge replacement until an election, until the next election. Okay, Texas Constitution, the judiciary, the top of the judiciary is two courts. One is called the Supreme Court, and it handles civil cases only. And then there's another one called the Court of Criminal Appeals, which, as its name implies, handles only criminal cases. Both the U.S. Constitution and state governments were created as sovereign. So when the U.S. Constitution was adopted, the federal government did not take all the rights away from states. The states are still sovereign, which means that the states can make whatever laws they want to, so long as they don't conflict with the U.S. Constitution. Ultimately, it's the people who are in control of both the federal government and the state government. The power of the people. That's democracy. That comes from two Greek words, demo and kratis, demokratis, people power. Okay. If somebody has a medical permit to use marijuana in one state, can it still be illegal for that person to possess and consume marijuana in Texas? Yes. Texas states normally have to give full faith and credit to the laws of other states. That's in the Constitution. But there is a public policy exception that if something is deemed so important by the state as to not permit it, then they don't have to. So if you go to Colorado and buy some marijuana, don't bring it to Texas, because you'll get in trouble. There was a case concerning the Confederacy. The question was raised, well, what about the laws that were passed by the states while they were part of the Confederate States of America, the Confederacy? What about those laws? Are they still good? There's a case called Texas versus White, which said, no, they are not good, because those were rebel governments. They were not legitimate governments. There is no right to secede from the Union. You don't have the right to do that. So those laws are not good. Okay. The 14th Amendment is extremely important. It's the one that has the equal protection clause in it, that all citizens, all people have the right to equal protection of the laws. And that clause has been the basis for landmark Supreme Court decisions like in Brown versus Board of Education, which outlawed segregated schools because it was deemed to be not equal protection of the laws to force a group of people to go to a different school simply because of the color of their skin, and that was not equal protection of the law. Even though the schools might be equal in physical campus and teachers and books, even though they may be physically equal, it's still not equal protection, because you're still stigmatizing a group of people and telling them that they are not worthy to go to school with white folks. Okay, we have lived under, or we lived under dual federalism concept. Dual federalism has been compared to a layer cake. That a layer cake like has two flavors. Maybe there's strawberry on top and chocolate underneath, and they stay separate. They that represents the relationship between the federal government and state governments. That the federal government minds its business, and the state governments mind their business, and they don't get involved with each other. It's called dual federalism, and that was the case up until the 1930s. Because in the 1930s, there was what came to be known as the Great Depression, and there was a strong impetus for the federal government to get involved and help the states combat the effects of the Great Depression. And so a system was emerged, which later was called a cooperative federalism, where the state governments and the federal governments cooperate with each other. Texas was one state that when Obamacare, also known as the Affordable Care Act, passed, they were given the option, or actually originally they were required to expand Medicaid, because what was happening was that some people fell in a gap between Medicaid and Obamacare. That Medicaid is earned tested, that and income tested. You can't make more than a certain amount of money. You can't have more than a certain amount of assets in order to qualify. But Obamacare, or the Affordable Care Act, says you got to make a certain amount of money in order to pay the premiums, pay your share of the premiums. So there was a gap there of people who made too much money or had too much assets to qualify for Medicaid, but they didn't have enough income to qualify for Obamacare, or the Affordable Care Act. So they were left in a gap. In Texas, that gap is somewhere around 750 to 750,000 to 1 million people are in that gap, and they don't qualify for either program. And Texas was one of those states that refused. Like I said, originally the law said that Texas had to do that, but the Supreme Court stepped in and said, no, you can't force the states to do that. And so a number of states did not expand Medicaid, but then a fair number of them came around, and there's only about 12 states now that have not expanded Medicaid to fill that gap. In 1989, there was a court case called Edgewood versus Kirby, and this court case, it was filed in state court and ultimately heard and decided by the state Supreme Court. Said that the education system in the state of Texas was unconstitutional because it is based upon property taxes, and property values determine how much tax you can get from the property. Different parts of the state, different parts of counties have different levels of property values. Property values in a bustling city like Houston are fairly high, but out in West Texas or South Texas or in the East Texas, property values may not be nearly as high, so their school systems don't have much money to educate the kids with. So the Supreme Court of Texas decided that that was unconstitutional because the state constitution said that every student has to be given an adequate education. Okay, so they said that's unconstitutional. The state legislature responded by establishing a fund whereby the wealthier school districts had to contribute to this fund, and this fund was used to distribute money to the poorer districts. And since you were sort of taking from the wealthy and giving to the poor, it was called the Robin Hood Plan. And it did some good. test scores started to raise up in the poorer school districts that previously were not doing well on the testing. But it didn't go, that didn't go very far. It went a little ways, but it didn't go all the ways toward equalizing educational opportunity in Texas. The case came up again just about 4 years ago to the Supreme Court of Texas, and Supreme Court of Texas decided that okay, the state has done a minimum amount of reform to qualify as being constitutional. So we're no longer going to consider the Texas education system as unconstitutional. It's for the legislature to straighten out the problems. We have an immigration program called DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. And this was provided by executive order by President Obama. And he said that, okay, young people who were brought here illegally by their parents should not be punished because they didn't do anything illegal. They were just brought by their parents. And so we're going to protect them from being deported. And also we're going to give them a work authorization so that they won't have to live on the street. They can get a job and support themselves. They won't have to depend upon some welfare program or handout. And that was called Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, DACA. Sometimes the federal government issues mandates. For example, the most famous one was No Child Left Behind. It said that you have to educate every child regardless of disabilities. Well, that's a good idea, a very good idea, but it costs money because special education costs money because the class size has to be small and you have to have special equipment and you have to have specialized teachers. So it costs money. The federal government said, okay, you have to do it. And so state government said, okay, give us some money, we'll be happy to do it. And they said, well, we don't have any money. You have to take care of that yourself. So that's called an unfunded mandate. Okay, the system was in place that Texas and other southern states had to get pre-clearance anytime they changed their voting system. They had to get pre-clearance from either the Department of Justice or the Court of Appeals in Washington, D.C. One or the other had to approve the change in voting laws to verify that they did not discriminate against minorities. Okay, that law was declared unconstitutional just not long ago, and so that is why the states now are passing voting laws which would otherwise probably not be approved in the pre-clearance process. Okay, in the Gulf Coast Plains, which is where we live, Houston, the shifts in population have shown that the suburbs are more Republican in voting patterns, and the urban cities are more Democratic in voting pattern. And of course, this is true nationwide. The cities have strong Democratic ties. There's minority populations in the big cities, which traditionally vote Democratic in large numbers. Okay, the new technologies in oil and gas production has put pressure on the need for water because huge amounts of water are used to inject into the Earth's rock formations to crack them open to release the oil and gas which previously was unobtainable. It's called fracking, and it's very controversial because you are rearranging a rock formation in the Earth's crust, and that can cause environmental problems. The U.S. Army's biggest active duty armored post is located here in Texas, called Fort Hood. Okay, in our system of federalism, we're subject to both federal and state laws. We have to obey federal laws and state laws. In 1850, the Compromise of 1850, which was passed by the U.S. Congress, allowed Texas to divide itself into as many as 7 separate states. No, that's not correct. There was a provision in the law that brought Texas into the United States, but it allowed Texas to divide itself into 5 states. But the Compromise of 1850 had to do with the boundaries of Texas, not with how many states they could divide themselves into, which of course they never did. They never did divide the state into 5 separate states. They never did do that. Okay, so the Compromise of 1850 had to do with the present boundaries, because Texas originally was much larger than it is today. It encompassed most of New Mexico, some of Colorado, some of Oklahoma, and there was even a little sliver that went up into Wyoming. But all that came out, and the federal government reimbursed Texas for that. The main reason was that Texas wanted to remain a slave state, and these areas were part of what had been designated as a free area. So if Texas wanted to keep their slaves, they had to take a haircut. Lawyers and slaveholders dominated the Secession Convention of 1861 when Texas voted to secede from the Union and join the Confederacy. Not surprisingly, lawyers and slaveholders dominated that. Okay, and then after that, when the war was over, Texas had to do a new constitution, 1869, and it created a strong governor's office, which they later regretted because the governor that was elected, Governor Davis, tended to be very autocratic, and that triggered the desire on the part of the leaders in Texas to call another constitutional convention in 1876, which set up a new constitution, which we now live on under today, and it did not create a strong governor. In fact, it created a weak governor, a weak executive. We call it a plural executive because all of the major figures in the executive department are elected on their own. They're not beholden to any other elected official. They're beholden only to the people who elected them. And it's called a plural executive because for example, the governor and the lieutenant governor run their own campaigns. They have their own voters. But very often, if they're members of the same party, which nowadays they are, they do help each other out. But they don't have to. It's not like in the U.S. government where the president and vice president run together, and then whoever gets elected appoints all the top officials in the cabinet and the executive department. It's not like that at all. It's just the opposite of that. Okay. The election of Richard Koch as governor in 1873, who was a Democrat, that ended the domination of Republicans after the Civil War. After the Civil War, Republicans dominated in Texas because the laws at that time, the Reconstruction period laws, said that anybody who had anything to do with the Confederacy could not hold public office. So consequently, the people who were involved with the Confederacy were Democrats, and so they could not hold public office. So a lot of Republicans got elected at that time. But when Richard Koch In 1873 became or was elected governor. That sort of ended the Republican rule. The Texas Bill of Rights, which is in the Article 1 of the Texas Constitution, has a list of rights guaranteed to victims of crime, such as the right to restitution and the right to be protected from the accused. In other words, from the person that they allege, harmed them. Okay, under the Texas Constitution, just like under the U.S. Constitution, the impeachment power is held by the House of Representatives. It's been used one time successfully. Governor Jim Ferguson was impeached, and he was tried, and he was removed from office. The lieutenant governor at that time became governor, and he's well known, or his name rather is well known in Houston because his name was William Hobby. Of course, we have Hobby Airport and Hobby Center for the Performing Arts, downtown Houston. And of course, the Senate is just like in the U.S. government. The Senate has to convict the person who's been impeached. County and municipal governments are established under the Constitution of the United States. Okay, when there's a constitutional amendment election, usually there's an extremely small turnout. There's very little interest in constitutional amendments. And the groups that push them and make sure that voters turn out who support their the ones that they favor and vote against those that they don't favor are interest groups. Interest groups who have some reason that they want this constitutional amendment to pass. Okay, the United States government and Texas and state governments enjoy dual sovereignty. Means that they can pass overlapping laws sometimes, criminal laws like on possession of drugs or on possession of firearms or what have you, that they can both legislate in that regard, so long as they don't conflict. Texas, for example, can expand and have a higher minimum wage if they want to. There's a federal minimum wage, but if Texas wants to, they can pass the minimum wage. Well, they do have a minimum wage, but it's actually lower than the federal minimum wage. But if Texas wanted to, they could increase it and make it more than the federal minimum wage. In some states, they have done that. Most notably, Washington State and California. I think New York also. And we talked about pre-clearance. Okay. The court case in 2013, Shelby County versus Holder, is the one that declared the Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act unconstitutional, so there's no more requirement for pre-clearance. So a state can pass voting laws, they can change their voting laws, and they don't have to get the okay from the Department of Justice or the federal court for the District of Columbia. Of course, they can still be sued, if they pass laws which discriminate or which appear to be unconstitutional. They can be challenged in court, and they often are. And states have no right to secede from the Union. There's no such thing. In some areas, the federal court has, or the federal government has preempted the states. In other words, they have passed laws and they say, hey, we're going to take care of this area, you stay out of it. Such things as like immigration, for example, that the federal government says, hey, that's our business, not yours. Okay, and of course, both the state government and the federal government can regulate elections. There's a specific clause in the U.S. Constitution which says that Congress can pass laws to regulate the elections in the state. But normally, the conduct of elections is left to the states. For example, the presidential election is not a national election. It is an election among 50 states. There are 50 elections, one in each state. There's no national presidential election. There are state presidential elections, and then they are combined through the Electoral College, and the winning candidate for president is selected. And local governments are, of course, the creation of the states, like counties and states. The U.S. Constitution makes no mention of local governments like counties and states. No mention of it. Also, the U.S. Constitution does not mention anything about political parties. There's nothing in the Constitution that says that there shall be two political parties, one named Democratic and the other one named Republican, blah, blah, blah. No such thing. Those things grew up because of normal divisions or differences of opinion. For example, we talked about the Great Compromise, where the large states and the small states reached a compromise on how the Congress would be composed. When the federal government wants to give money to the states to do things, they can do it in a couple of different ways, at least. One is called a block grant. Block grant means that the state can essentially do whatever they want to with the money. The federal government that says, okay, this is for education, do something. Okay. The other form of grant is called a categorical grant, and that is a targeted grant. The federal government provides a grant for education, but they say, well, you got to use the money for bilingual education, for example. It's earmarked for that. You have to use it for that. And the federal government, the regulators, will look over the shoulder of the local officials to make sure that they are doing the right thing with the money. Okay, so that is the conclusion of your review for the exam on Unit 1. So watch this exam, which I guess, or this review, which I guess you already have now, and then you can take the exam. The exam is 50 questions, true or false, or multiple choice, and it is a time test. So when you start the test, you have to finish it. You can't take breaks during the exam because otherwise you'll run out of time, and the great computer will cut you off. Okay, have a good day, and we'll see you in class. Bye-bye.